And that moment that really stood out was realizing strong data doesn't automatically translate into changes in clinical adoption. I remember asking, if the evidence is compelling, why isn't practice evolving? And that's when it clicked. Adoption depends on how information is interpreted across HCPs, payers, and patients.
Welcome to another episode of the Space Life Sciences Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Iskowitz, Editorial Director at Beghou. Today, we're digging into a question that sits at the heart of modern pharma. If the data are compelling, why doesn't clinical practice always change? My guest, Audrey Carnevale, who is Associate Director of Medical Communications at Averitas Pharma, answers that question by explaining the gap between simple awareness and clinical conviction, and why, when it comes to the evolving practice of medicine, the way data is communicated can be just as important as the data itself. Medical communications works across functions to align how science is understood. So whether someone's evaluating clinical use, access, or broader strategic implications, they're all working from the same foundation. And Audrey is one of its strongest practitioners. She brings a unique perspective, having worked in the field as a medical science liaison before moving into a strategic cross-functional role in medical. In this conversation, she explains why it takes multiple layers of evidence, not just clinical trial data, but also real-world evidence and economics insights disseminated through different media channels to ensure that a true understanding is achieved for where a product fits into the treatment algorithm. Audrey explains how AI can be used to assess differences in HCP engagements across specialties, regions, and practice types. And she shares some of the success her team has had running medical campaigns, as well as an example where cohesiveness between medical and the marketing and access teams could have been stronger right out of the gate. So without further ado, here's Audrey. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals featured and not those of their employer or any other company. Audrey, how are you? And welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Mark. I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Last time we spoke, we did a panel together actually in the fall at Reuters. So it's great to chat with you again. So let's just get started here, Audrey. With your career, I noticed that after you got your PhD, you worked as an MSL, a medical science liaison, before you made the shift into medical communications. Talk about why you did that transition kind of from the field into in-house medical communications.
Of course. So I started in the field, as you mentioned, as a medical science liaison, where I had the opportunity to engage directly with HCPs and was able to hear in real time what resonates and where the gaps existed. But over time, I became more interested in what was happening beyond those interactions and how the data was being translated across teams, how it showed up for different audiences, and where the disconnects in the narrative were truly limiting the impact. So I did have the opportunity to work a bit cross-functionally and saw how even the smallest differences in framing could influence not only strategy, but ultimately how care decisions were made. That's what drew me to medical communications, the ability to create a more cohesive approach so that whether someone engages through a publication, a digital resource, or a field discussion, they're building toward the same understanding and ultimately better patient outcomes.
I wanted to ask another kind of career-related question, kind of a fun one. Wondering, we hear, in the sports world, what was your welcome to the NFL moment, or what was your welcome to the NBA moment? Wondering, what was your welcome to pharma moment?
Yes, so great question. That moment that really stood out was realizing strong data doesn't automatically translate into changes in clinical adoption. I remember asking, if the evidence is compelling, why isn't practice evolving? And that's when it clicked. Adoption depends on how information is interpreted across HCPs, payers, and patients. It shifted my mindset from focusing on the data itself to focusing on what it means for each audience and how that data drives real-world decisions.
Right. It's such a good point. It's not a given just because the evidence is compelling that it will lead to a change in practice. It's a really good point. Let's just switch gears for a second and talk about the role of medical communications at Averitas. I'm wondering how does it dovetail with medical affairs at your company?
Yeah, of course. The role of medical communications is to ensure that scientific evidence is not only accurate, but actionable. We connect publications, digital channels, including email, websites, and social media platforms, along with field engagement into one coordinated system where each component reinforces the other. So, for example, a publication establishes the evidence, digital platforms extend reach and accessibility, and field teams bring it into clinical discussion. Sitting within medical affairs, we work across the functions to align how science is understood. So, whether someone is evaluating clinical use, access, or broader strategic implications, they're operating from the same foundation. I think of our organization as a beehive, and medical communications would be that honeycomb, the structure that organizes and creates the channels so everything can flow and be utilized appropriately. So, when that system is working well, the results are clear understanding, stronger clinical confidence, and ultimately better patient outcomes.
Pharma USA conference, there was a recurring theme about the need to align medical with commercial. I'm wondering, why is that such a kind of a recurring organizational challenge, and where do you see that show up in your work?
Yes, it is often a challenge. And I think a lot of it stems from the fact that medical and commercial do operate under different mandates and guardrails, but ultimately we're working towards the same goal. So that challenge arises when those perspectives evolve separately. Medical prioritizes depth and accuracy, while commercial focuses on clarity and reach. But without alignment, that can lead to subtle differences in how the same data is understood.
And sometimes you're working in parallel rather than kind of aligned.
Yeah, parallel without having enough crosstalk. Because I would say that alignment works best when, of course, we start earlier and center around that shared scientific narrative. So from there, each function is able to build on that foundation in a way that fits their role and their audience.
So then the natural follow up to that is, how do we make sure that medical and commercial are less fragmented in the way they work?
A practical way to think about it is progression, where each interaction should build understanding and answer the next logical question for that HCP. So when that structure is in place, you move from fragmented messaging into something that builds true clinical conviction and supports more confident decision making.
Let's talk about integration a little bit. If the goal for medical is to ensure that medicines are well understood by the professional community, do you see medical becoming more of an essential facet of the commercial and strategic mix these days? Why or why not?
I truly believe, yes, and medical has firmly established a seat at the strategic table and serves as a core pillar of how the organization operates today. And that shift is largely driven by the complexity of the current environment we're working in. Clinicians are navigating a growing volume of data alongside digital platforms that can introduce inconsistencies or misinterpretation of information. So, medical really does play that critical role in anchoring everything in evidence, ensuring that what is communicated is accurate, trusted, and relevant to real world practice. So when that foundation is strong, it not only improves alignment across teams, but also supports better and stronger clinical decisions.
Right. So it really is building bonds between that clinical evidence and the way medicine is practiced.
Yes, and being seen as that trusted scientific source where there are multiple teams that are having these data-driven conversations, but it's all based off that cohesive narrative that is, of course, driven by the data that medical is able to provide.
In the strategic area, medical really is unique in that it can get into the market before launch, even before the company has an approved product out there, working within their guardrails, with continuing medical education and so forth. Talk about how medical can become more of a strategic driver in this way.
Yeah, so when medical is involved early, it can help shape how a disease is understood before product even enters the conversation. Through publications, Congress engagement, and scientific exchange, we can clarify the disease progression, highlight unmet need, and identify educational gaps earlier on. That way, when new data does become available, it's being interpreted within an established framework rather than in isolated events. And this creates a more informed clinical audience, reduces friction in conviction, and ultimately supports more timely and appropriate adoption.
Are there other areas where companies, may not be using medical to full effect?
I think sometimes medical is pulled in to ensure the messaging is tied back accurately to the data, but medical can really help inform that strategic playbook and ensure that the content is modular. When you're coming to launch, when new data is about to be disseminated, there are different scenarios that you might have to encounter and plan for. And so medical can help ensure that the way the message is translated and communicated is relevant across multiple audiences and not misinterpreted. And that can even come down to some late stage decisions or final pull through. So really ensuring too that the content that's being developed is flexible and can be utilized in different resources and in different assets in different ways, and pressure testing that message alongside the marketing team can help ensure the strongest dissemination plan from a tactical perspective to better support the strategy of the organization, but and most importantly, to ensure it's being understood and it is relevant to the HCP audience.
Are there other types of data sources that medical would need to say buy, pre-launch, as you gear up for launch in coordination with the other commercial functions?
Yeah, I think the big piece of the evidence generation puzzle is having that mechanism of action understanding, the disease state awareness and unmet need tied into that phase 3 clinical data release, but not stopping there. So there's sub-analyses, there's post-hoc analyses that can be conducted to better support those identified educational gaps that you hope to bridge with further education, but also tying in real-world evidence to ensure applicability to clinical practice settings, and then building upon the evidence generation so you can have a strong value proposition story. Because in today's environment, it's a lot of different key players involved in the approach to patient care. So we have payers, we have clinicians, we have guidelines, and we also have the patients themselves. So ensuring that each piece of that data puzzle is going to be touched upon. And this is can evolve over a few years through the lifecycle management of the product, but ensuring that timeline is set in place and you know what questions that data is going to answer can really help prepare for a successful launch. And then those continued engagements as you're adding to the story and the narrative around that disease state and that product.
So let's double click on that for a second and talk about how you kind of use data to then fill in the HCP journey. Where do you think the biggest or the leakiest parts of the funnel are there for clinicians?
I have to say one of the biggest gaps is that transition from awareness to true clinical confidence. So clinicians may be aware of the data and of the product. They understand how it works, but they still question how it applies to specific patients or where it fits in that treatment pathway. So continuing to build that confidence and addressing that requires integrating multiple layers of evidence and not flooding with information, but really letting that story unfold. So as we just touched upon the clinical trials to the real world data to the health economics insights, so that clinical value and the broader impact are clear. So when it comes to those patients, not only is the product thought of, but there's a true understanding for where it fits in the treatment algorithm and what it looks like from a patient outcome perspective.
How do you quantify your impact, Audrey, that you're making in terms of making sure that there's that cohesiveness of the clinical message that you're trying to get across?
I think as anything, it's best to approach it as a staged learning process. So starting with disease understanding, defining what that looks like, then data interpretation, and ultimately application and practice. So not trying to achieve and accomplish too much at once, but using different channels to also support each of those stages. And we use both qualitative insights and quantitative data to determine when to introduce that next piece of information. So the audience is ready to receive it and it's relevant to them. So from a measurement perspective, we're looking for progression, repeat engagement, deeper interaction, and signals that understanding is truly evolving. Specifically, the goal is not just activity of click-through rates and downloads, but really defining a way to show measurable shift in how HCPs think and apply the data in practice. From a medical perspective, we also tie it to, we take we work in a different setting where we're not looking directly at prescription lift and treating patients directly, but peer-to-peer education, how our HCPs are using that data to inform their scientific conversations, how they're integrating it into their own educational pieces, if it's being incorporated into guidelines and updates and clinical pieces. So we also look at how our HCPs are using the data that we're sharing to inform their peers and educate others. And if they truly are what we would determine to be a clinical advocate, are they wanting a deeper understanding? Are they engaging with some more of the more in-depth pieces that we have available? So starting more at some surface level education and then seeing that progression into some more of the statistical heavy analyses and the deeper data sets also lets us know that they're shifting their mindset also into the adoption of the clinical information we have available.
I wanted to ask you about AI, of course. Have you found like a really worthwhile AI use case in medical? And if so, what would that be?
AI is great from the fact that it can enable us to identify patterns that would be difficult to detect manually. So differences in engagement across specialties, regions, and practice types. And we can we can cut the data in different ways, look at heat maps for how data is being digested and interpreted across the United States, also through different specialties, different archetypes. So where it's really falling and resonating. And it allows us to be more responsive by showing what's resonating and where additional clarity may be needed. So one of the most tangible benefits is speed. We can assess impact and adjust direction in near real time rather than waiting for campaign results or social media or website data that could take weeks or months to gather. So when applied thoughtfully, this allows us to scale more efficiently, refine our approach faster, and ultimately deliver more relevant information to clinicians when they need it based on their current interactions and what they're engaging with.
Have you had a chance to measure the impact on the medical function? And can you share like a metric in that area?
Yeah. So from an engagement perspective, a lot of our medical media campaigns have a 79% engagement rate, which is a lot higher than some of our marketing and commercial related campaigns, just because we believe that the medical content is more, it can be seen as a little bit more trusted, scientific based, and credible from a medical affairs perspective. So the engagement rates, the click through to our website resources, and even our following on our LinkedIn has increased with that targeted HCP engagement activity. So we're trying to meet them where they are with the information they need. And then we can create emails around the information they're engaging with when they're ready to go into a deeper dive. So we've had a lot of success with medical related campaigns just because the information is, we can touch upon some more topics that our commercial and marketing team can't regarding some of the more recent data that's been published in the field. And that allows us to build a more credible and wide casted net for our audience.
Now, Audrey, because this is the Space Life Sciences podcast and we're all about creating a safe space for commercial leaders to share, real world commercialization challenges and how they work through them. I was wondering if you could share an example of how perhaps medical, commercial, and marketing might not have been working in sync in optimal fashion and how you addressed that.
Yeah, it's a great example for us to share. So thank you for addressing it. And I think a common issue is when different teams emphasize different aspects of the same data, which can lead to subtle inconsistencies of how it's communicated, but then understood by your audiences. So in one instance, we had a retrospective analysis of real world evidence being published, and it's a very exciting data set. It had applicability to clinical practice, but we realized that not only internally, but externally, real world evidence wasn't quite understood by our audiences, how it differed from a randomized controlled clinical trial, what that meant from a data interpretation perspective. So although the data was already published and we were already communicating it and it was incorporated into our resources, we then had to take a step back and say, let's first describe what this data actually means and how it should be interpreted and then utilized across our teams for our HCP audiences. So we did have to take a step back to then accelerate forward and utilize the resources that had been developed with the results from the real world evidence analysis. But we first, unfortunately, if we had involved the teams cross-functionally earlier on, I think we could have developed those resources in a more consistent and a better timeline approach where we could first address what real-world evidence was, what it means for the HCPs and their patients, and from a payer perspective, and how it should be incorporated into their resources so it can be thoughtfully communicated across the different teams. So that was a lesson that we learned, and we're starting to do that now with some of our HEOR evidence that's coming out, and we're preparing for by involving the marketing and the access teams, by letting them know the statistical methodology. Not that they'll need to communicate that, but they can understand some of the background processes. So when we have the results, they can then understand how those fit into their resources and answer the questions for their audiences. So I think to summarize it as well, the clarity helps reduce rework. It improves consistency, and it makes it easier for stakeholders to interpret and then apply the information. And we can run forward and disseminate the data as soon as it is available.
A couple more questions for you, Audrey. If there was something that you wanted your commercial colleagues to know about medical, what would it be?
One misconception is that medical was seen primarily as a support and a review function, but in reality, we play a key role in shaping the strategy. So whether it's identifying evidence gaps, generating new data through analyses or publications, or guiding how that information is interpreted, can really help support not only our field medical team, but our commercial teams as well. So for example, our medical team is able to have some deeper conversations with our HCPs based off of some recent publications. But now we're looking to potentially incorporate that into a label update so then our commercial team can start to speak about that in appropriate messaging if we are able to include it in our label. So there's a lot that we can do to better support the communication of the commercial team. And sometimes I think that even though everyone says early involvement and cross-functional alignment is needed, there still can be that little voice that says this is just going to slow it down. So we never want to slow progress. And yes, we love our numbers, we love the data, but what medical also loves is knowing that the data is being shared and it's actually making a difference. So we don't want to delay, or I think reducing misalignment is a big one, but we're not here to slow down the process. So our goal is to really ensure that the information leaves us and leads to more informed decisions and better patient outcomes.
Okay. And Audrey, on that, let's just kind of double click on that for a second. Do you have some additional detail that you could share on in terms of working with marketing and media, how you reduced your cycle review times for medical media?
Yeah, so this one is a hot topic, especially for where I sit in the organization. Up until recent, medical and digital media was a newer concept. It's traditional, you hear about it with the commercial and marketing side, but disseminating our medical materials through digital channels was an approach that we felt like was very important to take, enabling us to grow in that ecosystem and share our credible scientific resources to a broader HCP audience. But putting the content and the assets and the ideas through our medical, legal, and regulatory review system caused a lot of delays. There was a lot of uh, back and forth about whether this has been done before. Is it promotional? How can we do this responsibly? So we paused. Unfortunately, jobs were sitting in the review cycle for a couple of months while we escalated and had deeper discussions. So I took time to develop a digital guidance framework, reviewed it with our heads and leads of the regulatory, legal, and compliance teams to say, here's what we would like to do in the digital space. Here's what's being done as an industry standard. How can we do this responsibly? What do we agree on? Where are the risks? How do we best mitigate them? So then when the content comes through for review, instead of months sitting in that review cycle, it's days to weeks. So we're really able to grow efficiently and effectively in keeping up with our media strategy, having our pieces out there, being able to collect insights and quantitative data, and it's not just held up internally as a concept or an idea. So although it can take a little bit of effort and muscle up front to establish those frameworks, I would say it's really helped streamline our approach into ideation to dissemination. So that's helped a lot as well.
One last question for you, Audrey. I just wanted to, before you go, ask what final parting advice you might have for your medical colleagues across the industry.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's such a great opportunity for medical to continue strengthening its role as a strategic pillar, connecting evidence, insights, and communication in a way that supports real world decision making. So when we do that well, we're not just sharing information, but we're helping to ensure that patients receive the right care at the right time and their HCPs feel confident that they're making the right decision for their patients. And that's what medical is here to do. And we love to support the organizational growth and ensure that our field teams feel equipped and confident in translating those messages and doing so.
Excellent. That was terrific. Well, Audrey, it's always a pleasure to talk to you about these really important commercialization issues. And I feel like medical communications and how it fits into the broader picture was one of those that might not have been so well understood. So I really appreciate you shedding some light on it. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.